The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a trail of diesel smoke and the kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Jake stood on the front steps of his grandmother's house, keys still warm in his palm, looking at the place that would now be home. Willowbrook Estates wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people moved in quietly. Every blade of grass seemed perfectly measured, every mailbox positioned at the exact same distance from the sidewalk. The houses stood like soldiers in formation, each one a monument to what money could buy and what rules could maintain. Jake had grown up visiting this house every summer, running through these same streets with scraped knees and grass stains on his clothes. But standing here as the new owner at 28, everything felt different. Bigger somehow. More serious. His grandmother had left him more than just a house. She'd left him a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. The house itself needed work. Grandma Rose had been 93 when she passed, and the last few years hadn't been kind to either of them. The paint was peeling near the gutters, the garden had grown wild, and the front porch sagged just enough to notice if you were looking for problems. Jake knew someone would be. He was carrying his laptop bag to the front door when he first saw her. A woman in her 50s with the kind of haircut that cost more than most people spent on groceries. Standing at the end of her driveway 3 houses down, she held a clipboard against her chest like armor and wore the expression of someone who'd just discovered a stain on white carpet. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. Jake raised his hand in what he hoped was a friendly wave. The woman's expression didn't change. She wrote something on her clipboard, turned around and walked back into her house with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. Jake shrugged and unlocked his front door. Moving was stressful for everyone, he figured. Maybe she was just having a bad day. The inside of the house smelled like the lavender soap his grandmother had used for decades, mixed with the mustiness that settles into a place when no one's been living there for months. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned since Christmas. It felt like stepping back in time. He spent the rest of the day unpacking essentials and making mental notes about what needed fixing first. The kitchen faucet dripped. The guest bathroom door stuck. The hardwood floors needed refinishing, but they were solid underneath decades of wear. Good bones, as his grandmother used to say. Everything worthwhile had good bones. By evening, Jake was sitting on the back porch with a sandwich and a beer, watching the sun set behind the oak tree that had been his favorite climbing spot as a kid. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of lawnmowers and the occasional car pulling into a driveway. He was just starting to relax when he heard footsteps on his front walkway. Then the doorbell rang with the insistent rhythm of someone who expected immediate attention. Jake opened the door to find the same woman from earlier, clipboard still in hand but now accompanied by a leather folder and the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm Linda Patterson, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." She didn't sound welcoming. She sounded like a tax auditor introducing herself. "That's nice of you," Jake said, stepping back to invite her in. "I'm Jake Thompson." Linda remained firmly planted on the front porch. Her eyes swept past him into the house, cataloging everything visible from the doorway. "Thompson," she repeated as if testing the name for authenticity. "And you're Rose Thompson's grandson," Jake finished. "She left me the house." "I see." Linda made a note on her clipboard. "Well, I'm sure you understand that Willowbrook Estates has certain standards to maintain. Property values, community aesthetics, that sort of thing. Your grandmother, bless her heart, had let some things slide in her final years." Jake felt a flash of irritation but kept his voice level. "What kind of things?" Linda gestured vaguely at the front of the house. "The paint, for starters. HOA guidelines require exterior maintenance every 5 to 7 years. The landscaping needs attention. And I couldn't help but notice your car." Jake glanced at his 10-year-old Honda Civic parked in the driveway. It was clean, reliable, and completely paid off. "What about my car?" "Well, it's just that most residents here drive vehicles more in keeping with the neighborhood's image. BMWs, Mercedes, that sort of thing. Nothing personal, of course." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that hadn't been properly extinguished. Jake stared at her, processing what she'd just said and trying to decide if she'd really meant it the way it sounded. "My car runs fine," he said finally, "and it's parked in my driveway." Of course. Linda's smile tightened at the corners. I'm just trying to help you understand how things work here. We all do our part to maintain the community we've built. Speaking of which, I have your welcome packet. She handed him the leather folder with the ceremony of someone presenting a legal document. HOA guidelines, contact information, meeting schedules. Our next meeting is Thursday evening at 7. I do hope you'll attend. It's important for new residents to understand their obligations. Obligations. Not opportunities or chances to get involved, obligations. I'll take a look, Jake said, accepting the folder. Wonderful. Linda stepped back but didn't move to leave. Oh, and Jake? The lawn service that most of our neighbors use is Precision Landscaping. They're familiar with our standards. I'd be happy to give you their number. Thanks. But I actually enjoyed taking care of my own yard. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he'd just announced his intention to raise chickens in the front garden. Well, as long as you maintain it properly. The HOA has specific guidelines about grass height, weed control, seasonal plantings. It's all in your packet. After she left, Jake stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching her walk back to her house with the same purposeful stride. She stopped at the end of his walkway, made another note on her clipboard, and glanced back at his car one more time before disappearing into her perfectly manicured landscape. Jake closed the door and opened the leather folder. 23 pages of rules, regulations, and requirements. Grass couldn't be more than 3 inches tall or less than 2. No vehicles could be parked in driveways for more than 48 hours without being moved. No exterior modifications without written approval from the Architectural Committee. He flipped through page after page of restrictions on everything, from mailbox colors to the types of flowers allowed in front gardens. At the bottom of the last page, in small print, was a note about enforcement procedures and fines for violations. That night, Jake called his father from the kitchen while making dinner. "How's the new place?" his dad asked, the familiar warmth in his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "Interesting," Jake said, stirring pasta and watching through the window as Linda watered her flowers with the precision of someone following a mathematical formula. "I met the HOA president today." "Ah," his father chuckled. "One of those neighborhoods, seems like it. She made some comments about my car not fitting the community image." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jake's father had spent 30 years working his way up through the legal system, dealing with every kind of discrimination and prejudice imaginable. He knew the sound of trouble when he heard it. "Just document everything," his father said quietly. "People like that usually reveal themselves eventually." Jake looked down at the HOA packet on his counter, then out at Linda's house where every light was positioned to illuminate her property like a museum display. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to figure that out." As he settled into bed that first night, Jake could hear the neighborhood settling into its evening routine. Garage doors closing, porch lights switching on, the soft hum of air conditioning units maintaining perfect indoor temperatures in perfect houses with perfect lawns. He had no idea that 3 houses down, Linda Patterson was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a fresh notepad, writing down everything she'd observed about her new neighbor and planning her next move. The first note appeared on Jake's windshield on a Thursday morning, tucked under the wiper blade like a parking ticket. He discovered it while heading out for work, coffee mug in one hand and laptop bag slung over his shoulder. Friendly reminder: HOA guidelines require all vehicles to be moved every 48 hours to prevent the appearance of abandoned property. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining our community standards. Willowbrook Estates HOA. Jake stared at the paper, reading it twice. His car had been parked in the same spot for exactly 3 days while he'd been working from home, setting up his office and dealing with internet installation. He crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, but the message was clear enough. Someone was watching. The second note came 5 days later, this time stuck to his front door with tape that left residue on the paint. Please be advised that lawn maintenance is required weekly during growing season. Current grass height appears to exceed HOA standards. Precision Landscaping offers competitive rates for busy homeowners. WEHOA. Jake walked to the edge of his property and looked at his grass. It was maybe 3.5 inches tall, slightly longer than the pristine carpet surrounding him, but hardly what anyone would call overgrown. He'd been planning to mow it that weekend anyway, but now it felt less like routine maintenance and more like giving in to surveillance. He mowed it that afternoon, taking his time and enjoying the physical work. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and there was something satisfying about the neat rows left behind by the mower. When he finished, he looked up to see Linda Patterson standing at her living room window, arms crossed, watching him with the intensity of a supervisor checking an employee's work. Jake waved. Linda stepped away from the window. The weekend brought rain, which meant Jake spent Saturday inside unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. Sunday morning dawned clear and beautiful. Perfect weather for starting the project he'd been most excited about since moving in. His grandmother's garden had been legendary once. Rose Thompson had grown vegetables that won prizes at the county fair, and flowers that made neighbors stop their evening walks just to admire the colors. But the last few years had been hard on her, and the garden had gradually returned to wilderness. Jake had found her old gardening journals in a kitchen drawer, filled with careful notes about what she'd planted where, when things bloomed, what combinations worked best. Reading through them felt like having a conversation with her across time. He started in the back corner where her tomato plants had once thrived, pulling weeds and turning soil that hadn't been worked in years. The earth was rich and dark underneath the neglect, still fertile after seasons of rest. He could see the skeleton of her old garden layout in the way certain plants had survived, the placement of stepping stones, the angle of morning sunlight through the oak tree's branches. By noon, he was covered in dirt and sweat, and happier than he'd been since moving in. This felt right. This felt like home. "Excuse me?" Jake looked up from where he was kneeling in the soil, hands full of dandelions, to find Linda Patterson standing at the edge of his property. She wore white pants and a blue blouse that looked fresh from the dry cleaner, not a wrinkle or stain anywhere. Her clipboard was present as always. "Hi, Linda," Jake said, wiping his hands on his jeans before standing. "Beautiful day for gardening. I need to discuss something with you." Her voice carried the tone of a principal calling a student to the office. "I've received several concerns from neighbors about your landscaping activities." Jake looked around his yard, then back at her. "Concerns about gardening?" "About unauthorized modifications to the property. Any changes to existing landscaping require approval from the Architectural Review Committee. It's clearly stated in Section 12 of your HOA guidelines." "I'm not changing anything," Jake said slowly. "I'm restoring my grandmother's garden. That's not how it appears to the community. You're removing established ground cover, disturbing the soil profile, and potentially altering drainage patterns. These activities require prior written approval." Jake felt something hot and uncomfortable rise in his chest. "You want me to get permission to pull weeds in my own backyard?" "I want you to follow the same rules as everyone else." Linda's voice sharpened. "This isn't about gardening, Jake. It's about maintaining property values and community standards. When one homeowner decides to ignore the guidelines, it affects everyone. What guidelines am I ignoring exactly?" Linda flipped through several pages on her clipboard with practiced efficiency. Section 12, subsection 4. No exterior modifications without architectural committee approval. Section 15, subsection 2. All landscaping must maintain established aesthetic continuity. Section 18. Property maintenance activities that generate noise, dust, or visual disruption require advance notification to adjacent neighbors. She recited the rules like a lawyer reading charges, each subsection delivered with increasing authority. "I pulled some weeds," Jake said. "In my own backyard. You've been working out here for 4 hours. Power tools, digging, debris piles visible from neighboring properties. Mrs. Chen from next door called this morning asking if there was construction happening." Jake glanced toward Mrs. Chen's house, where he could see an elderly woman peering through her kitchen curtains before quickly looking away. He'd been planning to introduce himself to his neighbors properly, maybe bring over some cookies or something. Now he wondered how many of them saw him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to know. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice reasonable. "I understand you have rules to follow, but I'm not doing construction. I'm gardening. My grandmother gardened here for 30 years. Your grandmother," Linda said with the tone of someone explaining something to a child, "was an established member of this community. She earned certain considerations through decades of contribution and compliance. You're new here. You need to prove that you understand and respect our values before expecting special treatment." The words hit Jake like cold water. Special treatment, as if maintaining his own property was asking for favors. What values are we talking about exactly? Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. Community standards, property maintenance, respect for neighbors' investment in their homes. The kind of values that keep neighborhoods like this desirable. There was something in the way she said neighborhoods like this that made Jake's jaw tighten. Something in the way her gaze swept over him, taking in his old t-shirt and dirt-stained jeans, the calluses on his hands from honest work, the 10-year-old car parked in his driveway. I'm not sure what you think I'm doing wrong, Jake said carefully, but I'm taking care of my property, same as anyone else, are you? Linda stepped closer, her voice dropping to the tone of someone sharing a confidence. Because I have to tell you, Jake, there are concerns in the community about your suitability for this neighborhood. My suitability. People work very hard to live here. They make sacrifices, follow rules, maintain standards. When someone moves in who doesn't seem to understand or appreciate what we've built, it creates anxiety, uncertainty about property values, questions about the direction the community is heading. Jake stared at her, processing what she was really saying underneath all the corporate speak about community standards and property values. The hot feeling in his chest spread to his face. And what exactly makes you think I don't appreciate this neighborhood? Well, for starters, you missed the HOA meeting Thursday night. That was your first opportunity to introduce yourself properly, to show that you're committed to being part of our community. Instead, neighbors had to wonder who you are, what you do for work, whether you have the resources to maintain a property like this long-term. I work in software development, Jake said. I can afford my mortgage just fine. Software development. Linda made a note on her clipboard. Freelance, contract work. Because financial stability is important in a community like this. We've had problems before with residents who seemed financially solid initially, but couldn't keep up with the demands of proper property maintenance. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jake felt his hands clench into fists and forced them to relax. I have a steady job with a good company, he said through gritted teeth. Not that it's any of your business. Everything about this community is my business. I'm elected by the homeowners to protect their interests. That includes making sure new residents understand their responsibilities. Linda looked around his yard again, taking inventory of everything from his gardening tools to the small pile of weeds he'd been collecting. I'm going to need you to suspend any further landscaping activities until you submit proper paperwork to the architectural committee. The application fee is $200, and the review process takes approximately 6 weeks. $200 to pull weeds in my own yard. $200 to ensure that your modifications align with community standards and don't negatively impact surrounding property values. Jake looked at the small patch of earth he'd been working on, then at Linda's perfectly composed face, then at the neighbors' houses where he could see curtains shifting as people watched this conversation unfold. And if I don't stop? Linda's smile returned, cold and sharp as winter sunlight. Then we'll have to discuss compliance enforcement procedures. Fines start at $50 per day for violations. Repeat offenses can result in liens against the property. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. Jake, I hope we can work together on this. I really do. But one way or another, everyone in Willowbrook Estates learns to follow the rules. Some people just take longer than others. As Linda walked away, Jake stood in his partially restored garden, dirt under his fingernails and rage burning in his throat. Around him, the neighborhood continued its perfect Sunday afternoon routine. Sprinklers turned on with mechanical precision. Someone started a leaf blower 3 houses down. A family loaded into their luxury SUV for what looked like a trip to soccer practice. Everything normal. Everything controlled. Everything exactly the way Linda Patterson wanted it to be. Jake picked up his gardening tools and went inside to wash the soil from his hands. But the feeling of being watched, of being judged and found wanting, lingered long after the dirt went down the drain. 3 weeks after the garden confrontation, Jake thought he might have found some peace. He'd submitted Linda's ridiculous application for permission to restore his grandmother's flower beds, paid the $200 fee, and tried to focus on the inside of the house while waiting for the architectural committee's decision. The hardwood floors were coming along beautifully. He'd spent his evenings sanding and staining, room by room, revealing the warm oak grain that had been hidden under decades of wear. The kitchen needed work, but he was taking his time, researching appliances and trying to honor his grandmother's memory while making the space his own. On Saturday morning, he was installing new cabinet hardware when the doorbell rang with the now familiar insistent rhythm that meant Linda Patterson was on his front porch. Jake wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find not just Linda, but two police officers standing behind her. His stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. "Good morning, officers," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Is there a problem?" The older officer, a stocky man with graying temples and tired eyes, stepped forward. "We received a call about a possible trespassing situation, ma'am." He nodded to Linda, who moved forward with her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "Officer Rodriguez, this is the situation I was telling you about." Linda's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "I was doing my morning property inspection when I observed this individual in the backyard of 47 Maple Street. I've never seen him before, and he was acting suspiciously." Jake blinked, processing what he'd just heard. "This is my house. I live here." "That's what he claims," Linda continued as if Jake hadn't spoken. "But I've been the HOA president for 6 years, and I know everyone in this neighborhood. I've never seen this person before today." The younger officer, who couldn't have been more than 25, was looking back and forth between Jake and Linda with the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Officer Rodriguez, however, was studying Jake with professional interest. "Sir, do you have identification showing your residence here?" "Of course." Jake reached for his wallet, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He'd never been in trouble with the law, but he understood the importance of not making any sudden movements when police were involved. "Driver's license has my address. I've got mortgage papers, utility bills, whatever you need to see." He handed over his license. Officer Rodriguez examined it carefully, comparing the address to the house number behind Jake. "This does show your residence as this address," the officer said. "Ma'am, you said you've never seen this gentleman before?" Linda's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I may have seen him around, but not frequently enough to recognize him as a legitimate resident. This neighborhood has had problems with transients, people who claim to be visiting or working but are actually casing properties for theft. When I saw someone I didn't recognize working in the backyard of what I knew to be an elderly woman's house, I was concerned for community safety. The elderly woman was my grandmother," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice level. "Rose Thompson. She passed away 4 months ago and left me the house." "So you claim," Linda said, "but I haven't seen any documentation proving that relationship or that transfer of ownership." Officer Rodriguez looked at Jake. "Do you have any documentation of property ownership?" "Inside, yes. Deed, will, probate documents. I can get them if you need to see them. That would be helpful." Jake invited the officers inside, pointedly not inviting Linda, but unable to prevent her from following them into his living room. He retrieved the file folder from his desk, hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the documents that proved his right to exist in his own home. The officers reviewed everything carefully while Linda stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the process with the expression of someone who'd been personally insulted by the existence of paperwork she hadn't pre-approved. "Everything appears to be in order," Officer Rodriguez said finally, handing the documents back to Jake. "Mr. Thompson is the legal owner of this property." "Well, obviously I made an honest mistake," Linda said, her tone suggesting the mistake was somehow Jake's fault. "But I hope you understand my position, officers. Community safety is my primary concern. When you see someone you don't recognize in a neighborhood like this acting suspiciously—" "I was planting flowers," Jake said, "in my own backyard." "Acting suspiciously how, ma'am?" the younger officer asked Linda. Linda glanced between the officers, clearly realizing she was on shakier ground than she'd anticipated. "He was digging, moving around equipment. It looked like he was searching for something or possibly burying something. The behavior was inconsistent with normal gardening activities." "I was planting bulbs," Jake said, his patience finally fraying. "Tulips and daffodils. My grandmother's favorites." Officer Rodriguez closed his notepad with the decisive snap of someone whose time had been wasted. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern for community safety, but in the future, you might want to verify someone's identity before calling in a trespassing complaint. Mr. Thompson, sorry for the inconvenience." After the officers left, Linda lingered in Jake's living room, looking around with undisguised curiosity at his furniture, his books, his grandmother's antique china cabinet that he'd been afraid to move. "Nice place," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. I have to admit I'm surprised. When I saw you that first day, I didn't think you'd be able to afford the maintenance on a property like this. Jake stared at her, wondering if she realized what she'd just admitted. You called the police? Because you didn't think I looked like I belonged. Here. I called the police because I didn't recognize you and you were acting suspiciously. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew exactly what she'd done and why, right? Jake moved toward the front door, opening it in what he hoped was an unmistakable invitation for her to leave. Well, now you know I live here. Linda didn't move toward the door. Instead, she pulled out her ever-present clipboard and made a show of consulting it. Actually, as long as I'm here, I wanted to discuss a few ongoing issues with your property maintenance. Issues. Your mailbox needs repainting. The HOA standard is classic black with gold numbering, refreshed every 2 years. Your gutters need cleaning, and I noticed you have newspapers accumulating on your front porch. Jake glanced toward his porch where exactly 2 newspapers sat folded neatly beside his front door. He'd been saving them to wrap dishes when he finished unpacking the china cabinet. 2 newspapers. Accumulated newspapers suggest either vacancy or neglect, both of which impact community aesthetics and property values. The HOA guidelines are very clear about maintaining clean, uncluttered exteriors. Is that all? Linda consulted her clipboard again. Actually, no. I've received complaints about noise from your property, power tools being used outside of approved hours, music played at inappropriate volumes, that sort of thing. What complaints? From who? Community members who prefer to remain anonymous. But the complaints are valid. Noise ordinances exist for a reason. Jake thought about his recent activities. He'd used a drill to hang pictures, played music softly while cleaning, run the vacuum cleaner at what he considered reasonable hours. Normal human activities in a normal human home. What are the approved hours for power tools? Weekdays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., weekends between noon and 3 p.m. No power tools on Sundays or holidays. And music? Should be inaudible from neighboring properties at all times. Jake looked around his living room, taking in the thick walls, double-pane windows, and solid construction that would muffle most reasonable sounds. Someone complained about music they couldn't actually hear. The complaint was about the principle, not the volume. This is a quiet community. People move here for peace and tranquility, not to listen to their neighbors' entertainment choices. Linda finally moved toward the door but stopped in the doorway and turned back to face him. Jake, I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help you understand how things work here. By calling the police and claiming I don't belong in my own house. By making sure you understand that actions have consequences in a community like this. People are watching. People are talking. The way you choose to conduct yourself will determine whether you're accepted here or whether you remain an outsider. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle between them. The architectural committee will be reviewing your landscaping application at next week's meeting. I'd strongly recommend attending. It would show good faith, demonstrate your commitment to following proper procedures. Plus, it's always easier to address concerns in person rather than through formal correspondence. After she left, Jake sat on his couch in the living room where his grandmother had watched the news every evening for 30 years, where she'd served him hot chocolate and told him stories about growing up during the Depression, where she taught him to play chess and let him win until he was old enough to win honestly. He pulled out his phone and called his father. They called the police on me, Jake said without preamble. What? The sharpness in his father's voice cut through Jake's exhaustion like a blade. Who called the police? Why? Jake told him everything. The garden confrontation, the escalating notes, Linda's comments about his suitability for the neighborhood, and finally this morning's, humiliation of having to prove his right to exist in his own home to uniformed officers while his neighbor watched with satisfaction. His father was quiet for a long time. After Jake finished talking, Judge Robert Thompson had spent 3 decades hearing cases about discrimination, harassment, and the abuse of petty authority. He knew the patterns by heart. Son, he said finally, I want you to start documenting everything. Every interaction, every note, every conversation. Dates, times, witnesses if there are any. Take pictures of anything she leaves on your property. Dad, I just want to live in Grandma's house and fix up her garden. I don't want a war. I know you don't, but Linda Patterson has already started one. The question is whether you're going to protect yourself when she escalates. Because she will escalate. People like her always do. That night, Jake started a notebook. He wrote down everything he could remember from the past month, from Linda's first visit to this morning's police call. As he wrote, patterns emerged that he hadn't seen while living through the individual incidents. The targeting, the escalation, the way she'd used official processes to harass him, then played the victim when challenged. The casual way she'd questioned his finances, his belonging, his right to be treated as an equal member of the community. Outside his window, Willowbrook Estate settled into its evening routine. Porch lights clicked on with timer precision. Garage doors rumbled closed. The neighborhood maintained its perfect facade of order and prosperity. But Jake was beginning to understand that under that facade was something much less perfect. Something that saw him not as a neighbor, but as a problem to be solved. And Linda Patterson had appointed herself as the solution. The HOA meeting was held in the community center's main room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and the kind of carpet that existed only in places where style went to die. Jake arrived at 7 sharp to find about 30 residents scattered across folding chairs. Most of them middle-aged or older, most of them white, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Linda Patterson stood at the front of the room behind a small podium, shuffling through papers with the efficiency of someone who'd run these meetings for years. She looked up as Jake entered, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly from neutral to alert. "Good evening, everyone," Linda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a wooden gavel. "Thank you for attending tonight's monthly Homeowners Association meeting. We have several items on our agenda, including architectural committee reports, budget updates, and some community concerns that need addressing." Jake took a seat in the back row, next to an elderly man who was reading a book and seemed to be attending under protest. The man glanced at Jake with curiosity but didn't speak. Linda worked through routine business with practiced boredom. Treasurer's report, maintenance contract renewals, a lengthy discussion about whether the community pool should be heated to 78 or 79 degrees. Jake found himself wondering how people found the energy to care about these details when there were actual problems in the world. "Now," Linda said, her voice taking on a different tone, "I'd like to discuss some community concerns that have been brought to my attention." She clicked to a new slide on the projector behind her. Jake's address appeared in bold letters, followed by a list of what Linda called compliance issues. "We have a situation at 47 Maple Street that requires community attention. The new resident has engaged in several activities that violate HOA guidelines and has shown resistance to following proper procedures." Jake felt every head in the room turn to look at him. Heat crawled up his neck as Linda continued her presentation. Unauthorized landscaping modifications, failure to maintain acceptable exterior aesthetics, noise violations, parking infractions, and most concerning, hostile behavior toward community leadership when these issues were addressed. She clicked to another slide. This one showed photographs of Jake's house taken from various angles, his slightly overgrown lawn before he'd mowed it, his car parked in his driveway, his gardening tools left on his back porch after working in the yard. "As you can see," Linda continued, "the property maintenance standards that keep our community desirable are not being met. More troubling is the attitude of resistance we've encountered when trying to help this resident understand our expectations." Jake stood up, every eye in the room focused on him with laser intensity. "I'd like to respond to that," he said, his voice carrying further than he'd intended in the quiet room. Linda's smile could have cut glass. "Of course. We always welcome community input. Please state your name for the record." "Jake Thompson. I live at 47 Maple Street, which apparently makes me tonight's entertainment." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The elderly man next to Jake's empty chair had stopped pretending to read his book. "I moved into my grandmother's house 6 weeks ago," Jake continued. "Since then, I've received harassment disguised as community concern, been subjected to surveillance, had the police called on me for gardening in my own backyard, and now I'm being publicly shamed at a community meeting for violations that include having 2 newspapers on my porch and parking my car in my own driveway." Linda's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the quick glance she threw to a woman in the 3rd row who was taking notes. "Mr. Thompson," Linda said, her voice dripping with practiced patience, "I understand that adjusting to community standards can be challenging for new residents. But these guidelines exist for everyone's benefit." "Community standards," Jake repeated, Like calling the police because you don't think someone looks like they belong in their own neighborhood. A murmur rippled through the room. Several residents exchanged glances. The woman taking notes looked up from her pad with obvious interest. Linda's composure cracked just slightly. That was a misunderstanding based on legitimate safety concerns. Safety concerns about someone planting flowers? The point is, Linda said, her voice rising slightly, that when community members express concerns about unfamiliar individuals engaging in suspicious activities, the HOA has a responsibility to investigate. Suspicious activities like gardening while not looking like your idea of a homeowner? The room fell silent. Jake could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant sound of traffic outside, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. A man in his 60s wearing a polo shirt and khakis raised his hand. Linda nodded to him with obvious relief at the interruption. "I'm Bill Chen," he said. "I live next door to Mr. Thompson. I wanted to say that I've watched him working on his property and everything he's doing looks like normal home maintenance to me. His grandmother Rose was a lovely woman, and from what I can see, he's taking good care of her place." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward his neighbor. Mrs. Chen had been watching from her kitchen window, but apparently Mr. Chen had been paying attention too. Linda's smile tightened. "Thank you for your input, Bill. Of course, individual opinions about what constitutes appropriate property maintenance can vary, which is why we have established guidelines and procedures." "What procedures?" asked a woman from the middle of the room. "I've lived here for 8 years and I've never seen anyone else have to pay $200 for permission to plant flowers in their own backyard." Linda shuffled her papers, clearly losing control of the narrative she'd planned to present. "The architectural committee review process applies to all exterior modifications, regardless of scope." "Since when?" The elderly man who'd been sitting next to Jake spoke up from the back of the room. "I've been here since this development opened 15 years ago. I've never needed permission to plant flowers. The guidelines have been updated over the years to reflect community needs," Linda said. "Updated when?" asked another resident. "I don't remember voting on any updates." Jake watched Linda's face as she realized her carefully planned public shaming session was backfiring. The room was buzzing with conversations as neighbors started questioning rules they'd apparently never heard of before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda called for order, rapping her gavel harder than necessary. "We're getting off track. The issue tonight is compliance with existing guidelines, not debate about the guidelines themselves. Actually," said the note-taking woman from the third row, "I'd like to know more about these guidelines. I'm Jennifer Walsh, and I've been the HOA secretary for 3 years. Some of these rules you're citing don't exist in any documentation I have." Linda's face flushed. "Jennifer, perhaps we should discuss documentation issues after the meeting." "No, I think we should discuss them now. Mr. Thompson, you said you were charged $200 for a landscaping application?" "That's correct," Jake said. "There is no landscaping application fee in our HOA bylaws," Jennifer said, consulting her notes. "Basic landscaping maintenance is explicitly excluded from architectural committee oversight." The room erupted in conversation. Jake felt like he was watching dominoes fall as Linda's fabricated authority structure collapsed in real time. "Furthermore," Jennifer continued, raising her voice above the chatter, "I have no record of any noise complaints about Mr. Thompson's property. No formal violations have been filed, and the photographs shown tonight were taken without proper notification to the homeowner, which violates our own privacy policies." Linda's composure was disintegrating rapidly. "Jennifer, you're overstepping your authority as secretary. Actually, I'm doing my job as secretary, which includes ensuring that HOA actions comply with our legal obligations. Linda, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your interpretation of your role as president." Jake looked around the room and saw something he hadn't expected. His neighbors were angry. Not at him, but at Linda. People were talking in small groups, comparing notes, sharing their own stories of harassment disguised as community standards. "I've been wondering why my property taxes went up," said Bill Chen. "Linda told me it was because property values were suffering due to maintenance issues in the neighborhood. Now I'm wondering if she made that up too." "She told me the same thing," said another resident. "Said there were problem properties bringing down everyone's home values? Did anyone else get charged fees for things that turned out to be normal maintenance?" asked a woman near the front. Hands went up around the room. Jake counted at least 6. Linda stood behind her podium looking like a general whose army had just switched sides. I think there's been some confusion tonight. Perhaps we should adjourn and schedule a follow-up meeting when people have had time to review the actual guidelines. No, said Jennifer Walsh, standing up and moving to the front of the room. I think we should vote on whether Linda Patterson should continue serving as HOA president, given the apparent discrepancies between her actions and our actual governing documents. You can't call for a vote, Linda snapped. That requires proper notice and procedures. Actually, said the elderly man from the back row, emergency votes can be called when board members are acting outside their authority. It's in Section 4 of the bylaws, Linda. Maybe you should have read them. Jake sat back down, feeling like a spectator at his own vindication. Around him, his neighbors were organizing themselves with the efficiency of people who'd finally found a common cause. The vote wasn't even close. Linda Patterson was removed as HOA president by a margin of 23-2, with 3 abstentions. Jennifer Walsh was elected interim president until proper elections could be held. As the meeting broke up, people approached Jake to apologize, to introduce themselves, to share their own stories of Linda's overreach. Bill Chen invited him over for coffee the next morning. Mrs. Walsh asked if he'd be interested in joining the architectural committee to help rewrite their guidelines. Linda gathered her papers and left without speaking to anyone. Her perfect composure finally cracked beyond repair. Jake walked home through the quiet neighborhood, past the perfect lawns and perfect houses, feeling like he could breathe properly for the first time since moving in. Tomorrow he would call his father and tell him the good news. Tomorrow he would plant those tulip bulbs without asking anyone's permission. But first, he was going to sit on his grandmother's front porch and enjoy the fact that Willowbrook Estates was finally starting to feel like home. The next morning brought a knock on Jake's door at 8 a.m. He opened it expecting Bill Chen with coffee, but instead found a man in an expensive suit holding a briefcase and looking deeply uncomfortable. Mr. Thompson, my name is David Rivers. I'm an attorney with Hartwell, Preston & Associates. I represent Linda Patterson in some personal matters. Jake's good mood evaporated instantly. What can I do for you, Mr. Rivers? May I come in? Mrs. Patterson has asked me to discuss a potential resolution to the recent misunderstandings between you and the Homeowners Association. Jake stepped aside to let the lawyer enter, wondering what Linda's next move could possibly be. He was about to find out that some people, when cornered, don't retreat. They double down. David Rivers sat stiffly on Jake's couch, briefcase balanced on his knees like armor. He had the uncomfortable look of a man who'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else, representing anyone else. Mr. Thompson, he began, pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. My client believes there may be grounds for a harassment lawsuit against you, based on your behavior at last night's HOA meeting. Jake stared at him. Harassment lawsuit? Against me? Mrs. Patterson feels that your public statements constituted defamation of character and created a hostile environment that has damaged her reputation in the community. She's prepared to seek damages for emotional distress and loss of standing. She called the police on me for gardening in my own backyard. That was a good faith effort to maintain community safety standards. Rivers flipped through his papers with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a script. However, Mrs. Patterson is willing to consider an alternative resolution. What kind of resolution? A voluntary sale of your property. Mrs. Patterson has a buyer who's prepared to offer you 15% above market value for a quick, quiet transaction. No inspections, no contingencies, closing within 30 days. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. She wants to buy me out. She wants to resolve this situation in a way that's beneficial for everyone. You make a substantial profit, the community avoids further disruption, and everyone moves forward without the expense and uncertainty of litigation. And if I say no? Rivers's expression became even more uncomfortable. Then Mrs. Patterson will be forced to pursue all available legal remedies. Harassment charges, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. She's also exploring options regarding your grandmother's will, questioning whether the property transfer was handled properly. The threat hit Jake like a physical blow, attacking his inheritance, his grandmother's final gift to him. The one thing that connected him to the woman who'd raised him summers and taught him everything important about life. There was nothing improper about my grandmother's will. Perhaps not. But legal challenges can be expensive and time-consuming to defend against, even when they're ultimately unsuccessful. Mrs. Patterson has substantial resources and is prepared to use them. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd thought he might finally build a life. Linda's house was visible 3 doors down, every detail perfect, every surface gleaming with the kind of maintenance that money could buy and malice could motivate. "Mr. Rivers," Jake said without turning around. "Can I ask you something?" "Certainly. Do you actually believe Mrs. Patterson has a legitimate legal case against me?" There was a long pause. When Jake turned around, Rivers was studying his briefcase with intense concentration. "My job is to represent my client's interests, not to evaluate the merits of her position." "That's not what I asked." Rivers sighed and looked up at Jake with the expression of a man carrying weights he hadn't chosen to lift. "Mr. Thompson, I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've seen a lot of different cases, a lot of different clients. Some fights are worth having and some aren't. And this one is going to be expensive, ugly, and public. Mrs. Patterson has already contacted 3 different law firms about representation. She's hired a private investigator to look into your background. She's reaching out to neighbors, former colleagues, anyone who might have information she can use." Jake felt his hands clench into fists. "She's investigating me. She's building a case. Whether that case has merit is debatable. But she has resources, determination, and nothing but time to make your life difficult." Rivers stood up and handed Jake a business card. "The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, Mrs. Patterson has instructed me to file papers. Whatever you decide, I'd suggest you retain counsel." After Rivers left, Jake sat in his living room staring at the business card and trying to process what had just happened. Linda Patterson wasn't backing down. She was escalating, using lawyers and investigators and legal threats to accomplish what social pressure hadn't managed. He called his father. "She hired a lawyer to threaten me," Jake said as soon as his dad picked up. "What kind of threats?" Jake told him everything. The harassment lawsuit, the investigation, the attack on his grandmother's will, the offer to buy him out if he'd just disappear quietly. His father was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried 30 years of judicial authority. "Son, Linda Patterson just made the biggest mistake of her life." "What do you mean?" "She went from being a small-time neighborhood bully to committing actual crimes. Extortion, abuse of process, possibly mail fraud if she's been collecting fake HOA fees. And now she's threatening to challenge a legal inheritance with no grounds whatsoever." Jake could hear his father moving around, the sound of papers being shuffled, drawers being opened. "Dad, I just want this to be over. Maybe I should take the offer and find somewhere else to live." "Absolutely not." The sharpness in his father's voice cut through Jake's exhaustion. "Running away won't solve anything. Linda Patterson will just find her next target, and that person might not have the resources to fight back. So what do I do? You let me make some phone calls." 2 hours later, Jake's doorbell rang. He opened it to find a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of presence that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Catherine Martinez from the law firm of Martinez & Associates. Your father asked me to stop by." Jake invited her in, noting the way she immediately took in every detail of his living room with professional interest. "Beautiful house," she said, settling into the chair Rivers had vacated. "Your grandmother had excellent taste. You knew her?" "I met her a few times at various community events. She was a remarkable woman." Catherine opened her briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Now let's talk about Linda Patterson." For the next hour, Jake told his story again, but this time to someone who took notes, asked pointed questions, and nodded with the satisfaction of a hunter who just spotted fresh tracks. "Mr. Thompson," Catherine said when he finished, "you're not the victim here. You're the key witness in what's about to become a very public criminal investigation." "Criminal investigation?" "Linda Patterson has been running an elaborate fraud scheme disguised as HOA management, collecting fees for services that don't exist, making up rules that aren't in any legal documents, using her position to harass residents she doesn't like. What she's done to you is just the tip of the iceberg." Catherine flipped through her notes. "I've already spoken to 3 other residents who've paid fake fees. The HOA's actual budget is about 1/3 of what Linda's been telling people it costs to run the community. The rest has been going into accounts she controls. She's been stealing money, among other things." The harassment, the fake police reports, the legal threats. She's committed multiple felonies. And now she's made the mistake of threatening the son of a Supreme Court justice with fabricated legal claims. Jake felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief exactly, but the first stirring of hope he'd felt since this nightmare began. What happens now? Now we file our own lawsuit. Harassment, discrimination, fraud, extortion, violation of civil rights. We're going to ask for damages, legal fees, and an injunction preventing her from any further contact with you or interference with your property. Catherine stood up and handed Jake her business card. We're also going to make sure the district attorney's office has all the evidence they need to file criminal charges. Linda Patterson picked the wrong person to mess with. Jake, she's about to learn exactly how wrong. The next morning, Jake was planting tulip bulbs in his grandmother's restored garden when he saw the police cars pull up to Linda's house. Not one patrol car this time, but 3 unmarked vehicles and what looked like federal agents in dark suits. Bill Chen appeared at the property line, coffee mug in hand and obvious curiosity on his face. Quite a showdown there, Bill said, nodding toward Linda's house where men in FBI jackets were carrying boxes out the front door. FBI? Jake asked. Apparently Linda's legal troubles go beyond the HOA. Word is she's been running similar schemes in 2 other communities. Mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion. They've been investigating her for months. Jake sat back on his heels, dirt-covered hands holding a tulip bulb that would bloom in his grandmother's garden come spring. How did you find out all that? Bill grinned. My wife plays bridge with Jennifer Walsh, the new HOA president has been very busy making phone calls since Tuesday night's meeting. They watched in comfortable silence as Linda Patterson was led to one of the unmarked cars in handcuffs. Her perfect composure finally completely shattered. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of the authority she'd wielded like a weapon. You know what the funny thing is? Bill said. She probably could have lived here peacefully for years if she'd just minded her own business. But some people can't help themselves. That evening, Jake called his father with an update. It's over, he said. Linda's been arrested. The FBI seized her records. And the new HOA president sent a letter to all residents apologizing for the harassment and promising a complete review of all fees and fines from the past 2 years. How do you feel? His father asked. Jake looked around his grandmother's living room, at the refinished floors and the restored furniture, at the windows that looked out on a garden that would soon bloom with flowers planted by his own hands. I feel like I'm finally home. 6 months later, Jake hosted his first neighborhood barbecue. The garden was in full bloom, a riot of color that drew compliments from everyone who saw it. Bill and Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings. Jennifer Walsh came with her kids and a bottle of wine. Even some of the neighbors who'd been too intimidated to speak up during Linda's reign stopped by to introduce themselves properly. As the sun set behind the oak tree where Jake had climbed as a child, he stood on his grandmother's back porch and watched his neighbors, his actual neighbors, not Linda's carefully controlled community of fear, laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company. Linda Patterson was serving 18 months in federal prison and would be paying restitution to the communities she'd defrauded for years to come. Her house had sold quickly to a young family with twin toddlers who were already making friends throughout the neighborhood. Jake never mentioned his father's position to his neighbors. It wasn't relevant anymore. He'd earned his place in Willowbrook Estates not through connections or intimidation, but by standing up for what was right and refusing to be driven away by someone who mistook cruelty for authority. Sometimes, late at night when he was working in his grandmother's garden, Jake could almost feel her presence. Approving of the flowers he'd chosen, proud of the stand he'd taken, satisfied that her house had become a true home once again. Justice, it turned out, grew best in soil that had been tended with patience, watered with truth, and protected by people who understood that a real community was built on respect, not fear. And in Jake's garden, that kind of justice bloomed more beautifully than any flower Linda Patterson could ever hope to control.